The air inside the gold-trimmed parlor of the mansion was thick with the scent of expensive French perfume and the bitter aroma of a woman's boiling anger. Chief Mrs. Ifelma, known across the state as the Iron Lady of Banana Island, stood with her hands on her hips, her eyes flashing like a summer storm. Ebele, a young girl with calloused hands and a spirit as quiet as a morning mist, stood before her, clutching a damp cleaning rag. A single drop of water had fallen from that rag, landing on the toe of Ifeoma's Italian leather shoes, and to the billionaire socialite, this was a crime against her status. "You common maid from the bush," Ifeoma sneered, her voice cutting through the silence of the grand hall. "Do you know how many months of your miserable salary it would take to replace these shoes? You are like a piece of furniture to me, and today you are a broken piece." Ebile did not cry or shout. She simply lowered her head, the weight of the mockery pressing against her heart. To Ifeoma, people were only as valuable as the gold they carried, and Ebele in her faded cotton uniform was worth less than nothing. As Ebele scrubbed the floors later that evening, her mind drifted far away from the marble tiles of Banana Island back to the red dust of her village in the east. She remembered the day her father passed away under the shade of the ancient Iroko tree, his hand in hers as he whispered his final wish. "Work hard in the city, my daughter," she had said, "but never let the city swallow your heart. True wealth is not what you keep in your pockets, but what you give to those who have even less." Ebele had promised her mother she would send every naira home, and she had kept that promise faithfully. In the cold mansion of the Iron Lady, Ebele was the only one who noticed the small details. She was the one who shared her meager lunch with the street dogs that paced the high compound walls. She was the one who greeted the gate man with a genuine smile when everyone else ignored him like a ghost. Even in the shadows of Ifelma's cruelty, Ebele remained a beacon of quiet kindness, unaware that the heavens were keeping a record of every selfless act she performed. Chief Mrs. Ifelma was currently in a whirlwind of preparations for her upcoming Diamond Jubilee. To her, this party was the ultimate proof of her power, a way to show her billionaire circle that she was the highest among them. She spent her days draped in expensive designer lace that cost more than a village school, backing orders at caterers and decorators until they trembled. "If a person is not a high chief or a director, they do not exist in my world," she would often brag while sipping champagne. She represented the very rot of heartless wealth, a woman who believed that poverty was a disease one could catch by looking at it for too long. She treated her staff like machines, expecting them to walk through the night without a word of thanks. Her pride was a wall of glass, shiny, hard, and completely transparent to those who knew her heart was empty. She didn't realize that the higher a wall is built on a foundation of pride, the louder it crashes when the wind finally decides to blow from a different direction.
The weather in Lagos shifted suddenly on the afternoon of the party preparations. A massive storm, the kind that people would talk about for years, broke over the city with a roar of thunder that shook the skyscrapers. The Great Lagos Flood had begun. Within an hour, the streets of Lekki and Banana Island turned into rushing brown rivers. The rain was a torrential sheet of grey, blurring the world until the streetlights looked like dying stars. In the middle of this chaos, Ifeoma realized that her personal driver had forgotten to stock the specific brand of vintage champagne she required for her guests. She looked at the storm and then at Ebele, who was busy polishing the silverware. "Go out and find me that champagne," Ifeoma commanded, pointing toward the door. "But ma, the water is already at the waist," Ebele pleaded, her voice trembling. Ifeoma simply laughed, a cold, metallic sound. "Then you had better start swimming, maid. If you are not back in 2 hours with those bottles, do not bother coming back to this gate. Your job ends today." Ebele stepped out into the drowning city, her thin frame battered by the wind and the stinging rain. The water was indeed deep, smelling of salt and the city's hidden filth. She waded through the Lekki streets, her heart hammering in her chest as luxury cars sped past her, splashing her with muddy water without a second thought. Just as she reached a flooded intersection where a street lamp flickered dangerously, she saw a sight that made her stop. An old man, dressed in rags that clung to his skeletal frame, was stuck in a deep gutter. He was clinging to the metal pole, his face a mask of exhaustion, and his body shivering so violently it seemed he might break. People in their expensive SUVs drove right past him, their tinted windows shielding them from the sight of human suffering. They saw only a destitute, a nuisance in the way of their journey. But Ebele saw a father, a grandfather, a human being who was about to be swallowed by the rising tide. She knew the time was ticking for her errand, but she could not leave him to die. Ebele struggled through the waist-deep water until she reached the old man. His skin was ice cold, and his eyes were clouded with the grey of age and the terror of the storm. "Don't worry, Papa," she whispered, though her own teeth were chattering. Ebele had one beautiful thing in her possession, a hand-woven wrapper her mother had made for her before she left the village. It was her only connection to home, the only thing that made her feel safe. Without a moment's hesitation, she unwound the thick fabric from her waist and wrapped it tightly around the shivering man. She then waded to a nearby roadside stall that was partially sheltered. She used her last 500 naira, money she had saved for her own dinner, to buy a cup of hot tea from a vendor who was packing up. She held the cup to the old man's lips, watching as the warmth slowly brought a spark of life back to his tired face. She was now soaked wet and penniless, but as she looked at him, she felt a warmth in her soul that no Lagos flood could ever wash away. The storm showed no signs of stopping, and the old man was too weak to walk. Ebele knew that if she stayed any longer, Ifeoma would surely lock her out, but she could not abandon the stranger on a wet shop porch. She knelt in the water and gestured for him to lean on her. With a strength that came from deep within her ancestral blood, she hoisted the heavy man onto her back. Every step through the flooded street felt like a mile. Her muscles ached and her breath came in ragged gasps, but she kept moving until she reached a dry, elevated veranda belonging to a closed supermarket. She laid him down gently and sat beside him, rubbing his hands to keep the blood flowing. She stayed with him for hours, watching over him like a silent guardian until the rain finally began to settle into a soft drizzle. By the time she stood up to head back to the mansion, she knew she had missed her deadline. She walked back through the mud, exhausted and empty-handed, fully expecting to find her few belongings thrown over the high compound walls.
Ebele reached the gates of the Banana Island mansion just as the first light of dawn began to crack the grey sky. She was trembling from the cold, her uniform torn and her hair matted with street silt. She expected to be met with Ifeoma's screams, but as she looked down at her bare feet, she froze in absolute shock. Everywhere she had stepped while carrying the old man, the muddy water was receding, and in its place, the very sand of the driveway was beginning to glitter. She rubbed her eyes, thinking the exhaustion was making her hallucinate, but it was true. The footprints she had made were now flecked with bright, unmistakable grains of gold. The mud had turned into a shimmering path that led from the street straight to the front door. Ebele gasped, her heart pounding against her ribs. She didn't understand what was happening, but she felt a strange electric peace in the air. The morning was silent, yet it felt as though the very atmosphere was singing. She stood at the door, a wet and humble maid, unaware that the world she knew was about to be turned upside down. By 7 in the morning, the neighborhood was in a total uproar. Word had spread among the other domestic staff and security guards that a trail of gold had appeared overnight. Neighbors peered over their fences, whispering in awe at the shimmering footprints that marked Ebele's path. Chief Mrs. Ifeoma marched out of her front door, her face a mask of confusion that quickly turned into greedy excitement. When she saw the gold-flecked sand, she did not think of a miracle. She thought only of profit. She turned to the gathering crowd, puffing out her chest. "Look at what the heavens have brought to my house," she shouted, her voice full of false pride. She saw Ebele standing by the pillar, wet and shivering. Ifeoma grabbed Ebele's arm and hissed in her ear, "You thief! You stole this from my safe and dropped it while you were running in the rain." Guards, lock her in the back room until I decide what to do with her. Ifeoma began to tell the neighbors that the gold was a reward for her own legendary generosity, claiming she had prayed for a sign of her greatness. The lies of the Iron Lady were interrupted by a sound that silenced the entire street. It was the high-pitched wail of police sirens, but they were accompanied by something much more imposing. A royal convoy of 30 identical black SUVs, all flying gold-fringed flags, began to pull into the cul-de-sac. Each vehicle was polished to a mirror shine, and the men who stepped out were not common soldiers, but royal guards dressed in traditional ceremonial regalia. The crowd fell back in a mixture of fear and fascination. This was a display of wealth that made even Ifeoma's mansion look like a shack. A herald, carrying a staff topped with a massive ivory carving, stepped forward. His voice boomed across the gates of Banana Island, commanding everyone to stand still. "We are looking for the woman with the golden hat," he announced, his eyes scanning the crowd. "The one who walked in the rain when the world turned its back on. The one who carried the weight of a king when her own pockets were empty." Ifeoma's eyes widened, and she immediately stepped forward, smoothing her silk wrapper. "I am the one you are looking for," Ifeoma cried out, pushing past her own gateman. She put on a performance that would have won an award, her voice cracking with fake emotion. "Yesterday, in that terrible storm, I saw a poor shivering man. Despite my wealth and my position, I went out into the mud myself. I gave him my finest lace to keep him warm and fed him with my own hands. I am the mother of the poor in this city. The gold you see on the ground is surely the heavens testifying to my kindness." She pointed to the gold footprints, claiming they were the marks of her own expensive shoes. The villagers and the neighbors looked at each other in confusion. They knew Ifeoma's character, but who were they to challenge a woman of her power? Ifeoma signaled for her guards to keep Ebele hidden in the boys' quarters, terrified that the girl might speak. She stood at the gate with a wide, greedy smile, already imagining the rewards the king would give her for her heroic act of mercy. The door of the largest SUV opened, and the crowd gasped as a man stepped out. He was no longer the ragged destitute from the gutter. He was dressed in robes of pure, hand-woven gold that shimmered like a sun trapped in fabric. He wore a crown of ancient ivory, and his presence was so commanding that the air seemed to grow still in his presence. This was Eze Ohazurume, the reclusive and legendary king of the gold-rich ancient kingdom in the east. He walked slowly towards Ifeoma, his eyes piercing through her mask of holiness. He stopped just inches from her face, and the smell of the storm seemed to radiate from him. "You say you helped me, chief?" the king asked, his voice like the low roll of thunder. "You say you wrapped me in your finest lace?" He reached out and pulled a small piece of fabric from his sleeve. It was a tattered, hand-woven cotton wrapper, smelling of simple village soap and honest labor. "This wrapper did not smell of your expensive French perfume, woman. It smelled of a mother's love and a daughter's sacrifice. Where is the one who truly owns this?" Ifeoma's face turned from a triumphant red to a sickly pale gray. She tried to speak, but her tongue felt like a dry leaf in her mouth. The king's guards did not wait for her permission. They marched straight past her and into the compound. They knew exactly where to look. They found Ebele in the small, dark room of the boys' quarters, still wearing her damp, torn uniform. When she was led out into the sunlight, a hush fell over Banana Island. Ebele looked at the man she had carried on her back, and her eyes filled with tears of recognition. She didn't see a king. She saw the man she had saved. To the utter shock of Ifeoma and every billionaire neighbor watching from their balconies, Eze Ohazurume walked to the humble headsmaid and bowed low before her. "In a city of millions, I found only one heart that was not made of stone," he said. He took the ivory crown from his head and touched it to Ebele's forehead. In that moment, the maid from the bush was revealed to the world as the rightful daughter of the crown. The king turned to the gathered crowd, his voice echoing against the high walls of the mansions. "I have grown old, and I have no heir to sit upon the golden throne," he announced. For years, I have searched for one who understands the weight of the people. One who knows that a crown is not a piece of jewelry, but a responsibility to the smallest among us. This girl carried me when I was nothing, and now she shall carry the future of my kingdom. He officially announced the adoption of Ebele as the princess of the Gold Lands. He gifted her with lands that stretched beyond the horizon and wealth that made Ifeoma's billions look like pocket change. Ebele stood tall, the golden footprint behind her now glowing with a light that blinded the greedy. She did not look at Ifeoma with anger, but with a quiet, regal dignity. The king signaled for his guards to bring a robe of silk and pearls, and as they draped it over Ebele's shoulders, the village girl vanished, and a true princess emerged from the shadows of the storm. The news of Ebele's elevation spread through Lagos like a wildfire. Ifeoma, consumed by a burning envy that felt like a physical sickness in her chest, could not bear to see her former maid in such glory. She couldn't understand why her own billions hadn't bought her the king's favor. Driven by a desperate greed, she traveled in secret to a dark part of the city to see a powerful babalawo or shaman. She arrived at his hut, which smelled of ancient herbs and forgotten shadows. "I want what the girl has," she demanded, throwing a stack of high-denomination notes on his wooden table. "I want a charm that will make the king love me. I want his gold to be mine. Why did the heavens choose a common maid over a chief like me?" The shaman looked at her with eyes that seemed to see the blackness of her soul. He chuckled, a sound like dry bones rattling in a jar. "The king is not moved by charms, woman. He is moved by the heart. But if you want a reward, you must pass the second test of the rain." Ifeoma finally spotted a woman sitting by the roadside in a patch of oily mud. The woman was dressed in rags so dirty you could not tell their original color, and her face was hidden by a matted tangle of hair. She looked like the very definition of a suffering soul. Ifeoma pulled her SUV to a stop, making sure to keep her windows up until the last moment to avoid the smell of the area. She stepped out onto a piece of cardboard to keep her shoes clean and marched toward the woman. Without saying a word of comfort or even looking the woman in the eye, Ifeoma practically threw the heavy gold and diamond necklace at her. "Take it and bless me quickly," Ifeoma shouted, her voice full of impatience and arrogance. "I have given you wealth you could never dream of. Now, let the king see my works and reward me with his gold." She turned around and marched back to her car, feeling triumphant. She believed she had bought her way into the king's heart, just as she had bought everything else in her life. What Ifeoma did not know was that the beggar woman was not a stranger at all. She was the king's own sister, a woman of great spiritual power who had taken the form of a destitute to see if Ifeoma had truly learned any lesson from Ebele's rise. The woman picked up the heavy necklace from the mud and looked at it. She didn't see the diamonds or the gold. She saw the heart of the woman who had thrown it. She saw thorns, dry bone, and a black void of greed. She stood up and watched as Ifeoma's car sped away, splashing mud onto the very gift she had just given. The woman whispered a word into the wind, a word of judgment that traveled through the streets of Lagos and straight to the foundation of the Banana Island mansion. The Iron Lady had failed the test of the heart. She had tried to bribe the heavens, and in the world of the ancient kings, that was the greatest sin of all. The necklace in the woman's hand turned into a handful of dry grey dust, blowing away in the Lagos breeze. That evening, Ifeoma hosted a massive party at her mansion, despite the fact that the king had ignored her invitations. She wanted to show the world she was still the queen of Banana Island. She sat in her living room, surrounded by her socialite friends, boasting about her extraordinary act of charity earlier that day. "I gave a beggar enough gold to buy a village," she laughed, reaching for her designer handbag to show off her latest luxury purchase. But as she clicked the gold latch of her bag, a shocking cinematic moment occurred. Instead of her phone or her wallet, a stream of hot, dry Sahara sand began to pour out. She gasped and dropped the bag, but the sand did not stop. It gushed out like a fountain, filling her lap and piling up on the expensive rug. Panic broke out as her friends opened their own bags, and more sand poured out, burying the silk cushions and the gold-trimmed tables. Within minutes, the living room was filled with thousands of pounds of grey, useless sand, a supernatural deluge that seemed to come from nowhere. The nightmare did not end with the sand. As the guests fled in terror, a team of government officials and bank representatives arrived at the gate. In a swift move that left Ifeoma paralyzed with shock, they presented her with documents showing that her entire empire was built on a foundation of fraud and stolen labor. Her accounts were frozen instantly, her fleet of luxury cars was towed away, and her mansion was seized by the state. The Iron Lady was left standing in the middle of her sand-filled parlor, her designer lace torn and her Italian shoes buried in the grit. By the next morning, she was evicted from Banana Island with nothing but a small plastic bag of her personal belongings. She found herself standing on the very street corner where Ebele had once waited for the bus. She was left with nothing but a single room in a crowded slum house, a place with a leaking roof and a dirt floor. The exact kind of place she had once mocked Ebele from coming from. Her pride had become her prison, and her wealth had turned to dust. Months passed, and the story of the maid and the sand became a legend in the city. Princess Ebele did not remain in the palace in the east. She returned to Lagos, not in pride, but in a royal convoy filled with food, medicine, and books for the poor. She visited the slums where the domestic workers lived, the places the government had forgotten. One afternoon, her convoy pulled up to a dilapidated building in a crowded neighborhood. Ebele stepped out, dressed in simple but regal attire, her presence bringing a sense of hope to the dusty street. She walked through the narrow hallways until she reached a small, dark room. Inside, sitting on a wooden stool and staring at a pile of grey sand in the corner, was Ifeoma. The former socialite looked old and broken, her hands rough from the labor she now had to do to survive. Ebele stood in the doorway, her shadow falling over the woman who had once treated her like a piece of furniture. She did not come to mock, she came to offer a hand. "I have started a foundation, Ma," Ebele said, her voice soft and full of the same kindness she had shown the old man in the rain. "It is a center for the education and protection of house helps and orphans. I need people who understand what it means to lose everything to help me lead it. I am offering you a job, Ifeoma. You will have a clean room, a fair salary, and a chance to do some good in this city." The room fell silent as the neighbors gathered at the window to see the great reversal. Ifeoma looked at Ebele, and for a moment, the old pride flared up in her eyes. She looked at the royal guards and the beautiful car outside, and the bitterness in her heart boiled over. She could not stand to be an employee of the girl she had once whipped. "I would rather rot in this sand than work for a maid," Ifeoma spat, turning her back on the princess. Ebele sighed, a sound of deep, profound sadness. She realized that some hearts are so hard that even the rain of blessing cannot soften them. She left a bag of food and a Bible on the stool and walked away. The king, Eze Ohazurumi, watched from his palace in the east as Ebele transformed the land. He was so moved by her wisdom that he bought Ifeoma's former mansion in Banana Island. But he did not keep it for himself. He ordered the gold trimmings to be melted down and the high walls to be torn down. He turned the estate into the House of Mercy. It became a magnificent boarding school and vocational center where young girls from the bush were given a top-quality education and treated with the dignity they deserved. The parlor where Ifeoma once screamed at Ebele became a library where children read about the history of their people. The Iron Lady's name was erased from the gates, replaced by a simple carving of a girl carrying an old man through the rain. The mansion became a beacon of light for the entire city, a place where the smallest person was treated like royalty. It was a physical manifestation of Ebele's heart, a garden of hope that grew in the very place where cruelty had once reigned supreme. As the years passed, Ezeo Hazurume realized that his journey was coming to an end. He called Ebele to the golden throne and placed the ancient ivory staff in her hand. "You have not just won the crown," he said, his voice weak but full of pride. "You have become the crown." As Ebele was officially crowned as the reigning queen of the Goldlands, a final beautiful miracle occurred. A gentle, cooling rain began to fall over the entire kingdom. It was not a storm of destruction like the one in Lagos, but a rain of blessing. Wherever the water touched the earth, the crops grew twice as tall overnight. The sick who stood in the rain felt their pains vanish, and the dry wells filled with sweet, clear water. The land prospered beyond anything the ancestors had ever seen. Ebele stood on her balcony, her mother by her side, watching as her people danced in the rain. She realized that her father was right. True wealth was the love she had given away, which had now returned to her 1,000-fold. The story of the Maid and the King remains the most viral legend in the city of Lagos and beyond, a story told to every house help and every billionaire alike. It is a reminder that the heavens do not look at the designer lace or the titles, but at the scars on the hands and the warmth in the soul. Ebele remained a queen of the people, never forgetting the weight of the man she carried through the flood. As for Ifeoma, they say she still sits in that small room staring at the sand that will never turn back into gold. The narrator's voice fades into the sound of the falling rain as the final lesson is delivered to the listening world. Money can buy a bed, but it cannot buy sleep. It can buy a house, but only kindness makes it a home. The gold on the ground may fade, but the gold in the heart is eternal. What lesson do you take from this story? Tell us in the comments below.